Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business stories, their context, their relevance and policy impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. Retail inflation has fallen to its lowest level in 5 years, driven by slowing of rises in food prices. Consumer inflation rate is now at 3.17%, well below the Reserve Bank of India's medium target of 4%. However, wholesale inflation has risen to a 30-month high of 5.25%, suggesting price pressures in the broader economy. Now, the Reserve Bank of India governor later said that he expects inflation, excluding food and fuel, to remain high. Well, let's decode these developments and statements and ask what it means for the Aam Aadmi in terms of cost of living as well as interest rates for loans. To discuss this, I'm joined by Somajit Neogi of India Ratings and Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at Care Ratings. Thank you both for joining us. Okay, Somajit, let me begin with you. The consumer price inflation is down and wholesale price inflation is up. So let's first understand, why is consumer inflation down, which is of course good news and we should be all happy about.
The primary evidence what is suggesting is that the consumer inflation, it's actually, if you look at the basket, it's almost 50% consistence of food inflation and the food components. And the food components are down months after month. Whereas if you look at the WPI, so the major component is a non-food basket, where the food components is around 15%.
Right.
So globally, the commodity prices has recovered substantially from mid of FY16, coupled with the oil price. So all these things are corroborating into higher WPI, and of course the base has the major role in the WPI throughout the FY15-16, including last year too. Overall, the base were low, so any uptick into that inflation is adding more pressure. And one of the major element in WPI, why it is 5.25%, it's actually all of a sudden they have revised coke price, coke coal, so that is 85% up month on month, year on year. Excluding that, it's substantially low, but of course continuously it's showing higher trend.
Right. Okay. So Madan, I don't know if you have any views on this dichotomy between CPI, consumer price inflation, and WPI, which is wholesale price inflation, and what does one take away from it? What do we, as let's say the Aam Aadmi, interpret from this?
See, as far as the common man is concerned, I think what should be relevant is more the CPI inflation, because it more or less matches the kind of a consumption basket which the household has. Whereas the WPI, I would tend to think, is more of a manufacturer's index, where industry can take heart to the fact that it's gone up to around 5%, which means that their pricing power has been retained. Now, in the past, I remember we always had a situation where the CPI inflation number would be higher than the WPI, and we would normally say if the WPI was 3%, CPI would be 5%. But now with the new compositions of these two indices and the way in which the prices have been moving, I think that's probably more important, because we always had a CPI index which was biased towards food items, and the WPI which was more towards fuel and manufactured products. But the kind of developments we have seen in terms of global commodity prices, especially crude oil and related items, as well as manufactured prices, does give us a feeling that with overall economic conditions looking up, there would be a tendency for these prices to also move up. So the WPI, to my mind, will remain elevated in the region of around 4–4.5% for some more time, while the CPI inflation will remain fairly benign at 3–3.5% until such time we get any new news about the Rabi harvest to begin with, and probably later on the monsoon.
Madan, so the question is, so at 3%, at 3.1% or almost 3%, I mean, it's reasonably a good place to be in. So should we be in some ways happy about this? Or the other question is, does this not reflect the actual, let's say, the experience of someone on ground?
No, I think there are two parts. If I'm a household, I think I'll definitely be very happy in terms of a 3% inflation number. And I can testify to the fact that since I do my own shopping, I have seen that the prices of food grains, of vegetables, fruits have actually come down. So definitely I'm better off. But if you look at the way in which the RBI has viewed it, at least when they had their policy last time, in changing the stance from being accommodative to neutral, gives us a feeling that somehow there is this feeling that inflationary expectations have built up, and that actually leads to the second component of your CPI inflation, which is core CPI inflation, which is hovering around the region of around 5%. And our expectations that this number will probably continue to move upwards, definitely won't come down. The best possible situation where it remains normal. So as a central banker, one would definitely be concerned about the expectations and the future trends, whereas households can take heart that it will take some time before it really affects them in a decisive manner. As of now, food inflation is down, therefore they're better off.
Samajit, how do you see the response, or what do you feel the likely response of the Reserve Bank should be in a situation like this? I mean, of course, they're saying that they're looking at the overall inflation pie rather than just the food inflation.
This is not only a concern for us, but also good news for the advanced economy. In tandem with the global commodity prices, if you look at the inflation trajectory in advanced economy has improved substantially, which is good news for them. So possibly we can say they are out of the fear of the deep deflation. Most of the economies are showing a kind of stability in price. So that's a good news for them, but that's the bad news for two count. One is definitely it will exert pressure on the emerging economies, and of course with the improvement in the inflationary condition, advanced economy may start thinking on the more rate normalization, which is also goes against emerging economies. So these two are actually most critical factor. That is one of the reason actually RBI has shifted its policy stance to neutral. The reason is that really the global situation, the way it is turning unfavorable, and we have a fresh experience of 2013. So we can't expect the same thing to happen once more. So creating kind of the first level of protection.
Okay. Madan, if you were to look ahead, what should the policy response be to a situation like this? I mean, should we let things be as they are and assume that, as you said, it could remain benign and therefore nothing much will happen? Or should there be some active stimulus?
See, actually, ideally at this particular point of time, I think giving a stimulus would have probably helped only at the margin, because when we are looking at our economy, I think the demand conditions are fairly dormant. And unless there's a pickup in demand only at that particular point of time, the availability of credit as well as the cost of credit will matter. So as of today, just suppose in the month of February, the RBI did decide to lower the interest rates. To my mind, I don't think that would have made too much of a difference to overall demand conditions. So therefore, tarrying for some time and waiting to see how the inflation number behaves, and as and when the Indian economy shows signs of picking up, which could only be from the next financial year, definitely not for the remaining 1.5 months of this year, the RBI would still have the prerogative to really lower the interest rates. So this gives it the benefit of also having an additional inflation number, which could be the basis of its decision, as well as to evaluate the overall credit conditions which are there in the economy. Because as of now, lowering the rates would not have made too much of sense, because banks have been lowering the rates on their own volition on account of the surplus liquidity in the system.
Samya, to what extent are we seeing the lag effects of demonetization, and is that reflected in maybe lower inflation numbers?
To a certain extent, it is still visible in particularly benign demand in the consumer durables and non-durables number. But with the remonetization process already started playing, I think if it has really impacted, a portion will definitely go away in the coming months. But one thing I must highlight this thing, this is the classic scenario we are entering into. Because of the low inflation particularly, the consumer will continue to get the benefit except the oil price. But at the same time, the increase in the commodity prices are actually exerting pressure on the input cost for the corporate. In a situation when the overall the demand condition, it's still submissive, still down, corporates might not be in a position to pass on the entire increase the price. So possibly there will be further dent on the corporate profitability that we have seen this 2016. When overall top line didn't grow as much, but the overall profitability grew much better, which may not be a position by and large for the 17-18. That will again slightly negative for the some corporate.
Okay. Okay. So, Madan, if I were to ask you for your outlook now, given how we've started 2017 calendar, and if you were to look ahead, more in the context of global, because as we've been discussing on Policy Watch, global external factors are going to play a much more critical role in the way things pan out for the economy. What's your outlook?
No, in fact, we have to look at it from 2 points of view. If I'm going to look at the CPI inflation, it's going to be continue to be dominated by what happens on the food side. So the overall Rabi harvest and the way in which the monsoon behaves going ahead is going to be affecting the CPI inflation number to a very large extent. But if I'm looking at the WPI, definitely it's the international factor which is going to play a greater role. And from what we understand, it does look as if that crude oil prices are only going to trend upwards. That could be towards the 60-65 mark, not going beyond that. Metal prices have already started regaining their earlier levels, which would go along with the global economic recovery. So I think the WPI would tend to be probably a little more higher than the CPI inflation number for the next few months until we get more clarity on how food prices are behaving.
And your outlook, and you've also released India Ratings outlook for 2018, so 17-18. So how is it looking, and what are they?
For the inflation, one of the factors that we are also considering that possibly the WPI will be higher in FY18. So we are expecting average to be around 4.5%, whereas CPI to be around close to 4%, slightly above 4%. So overall,
so you're seeing a sort of
reconvergence, but we are also kind of estimating some kind of a benign inflation print overall, because two factors: overall the consumption is still we are expecting consumption to pick up, but compared to the earlier cycle, the consumption to remain down, and capacity utilization level has been low for the quite some time, and will continue to be low. So overall, the influence of the low demand and excess capacity will continue to be favorable for the consumer. But having said that, the currency will be the measure to determine the commodity prices in India, where also we are seeing that the stable commodity, stable rupee, and a measured depreciation towards the end of the year.
Okay. On the global front, Madan, I mean, what's your outlook in as much as it's going to affect India? I know I asked that question earlier, but if I were to come back to that and look at it in the context of the post-Trump world, and is that something that we should be re-evaluating or re-looking right away?
In terms of inflation, I don't think that's going to make much of an impact. I think what's happening on the oil front is more about what OPEC does and how overall economic demand conditions are, which will actually show as to whether demand is going to increase, how supply responds to the demand increases. But and also in terms of metals, I think it comes mainly from the faster growing regions. I think that's where the concern would really be, or where one will have to really observe, because a good thing for economic growth will also mean higher prices of metals. Donald Trump's, I think his policies is going to be more effective when it comes to our current account, where our remittances, our software receipts are more likely to be affected, maybe certain specific sectors. But on the whole, I don't really think that's going to have much of a bearing on inflation.
Well, we've run out of time. Thank you, Madan, and thank you, Somajit. We need to go in for a break. Now, coming up on the other side, India's IT industry is facing considerable headwinds, perhaps for the first time in this form. We find out how and what lies ahead with NASSCOM President R. Chandrasekhar. Stay with us.
I'm Amritan Sharai, and you're watching Constitutionally Yours.
The word environment is always used to cover certain larger issues.
The first priority of the government is to protect the environment.
Providing good environment of life to the citizen is a fundamental right.
Corporate lobbying by the industrialists is negatively affecting the working strategy.
Sanctions were given by the Environment Ministry for so many industries, for corporate lobbies.
Join us as we try to understand contemporary issues related to the Constitution. Watch Constitutionally Yours on Rajya Sabha Television.
Welcome back to Policy Watch. India's 154 billion IT sector is facing considerable headwinds. The industry, which employs 4 million people, could be the victim of a new Donald Trump administration move which may go after H1B visas, which Indian companies need to place engineers onshore to execute large projects along with their colleagues in India. But that's not all. The industry is also facing considerable and fundamental skill challenges needed to address the faster growing digital market as opposed to the traditional arbitrage market. Moreover, industry body NASSCOM has pulled back from its annual guidance this year, saying it will wait for a few more months for clarity to understand the challenges ahead and how the industry is coping. I caught up with R. Chandrasekhar, president of NASSCOM, and also former telecom secretary to the government of India, and began by asking him why the industry was facing so many challenges and what was it doing about it at this point.
So the first is the technological secular trends, which have been around for a while and which have been, sweeping the whole technology world. And this is the advent of, digital technologies, the SMAC, social media, mobility, analytics, cloud, Internet of Things, robotics, and the list is endless, So all of those are making huge changes in technology and the way it impacts everybody and everything. And we're seeing that in our daily lives. And especially, the younger generation seem to be faster adopters, although it's not an age-specific thing. But just statistically, they are quicker adopters. And in India, with a young population, obviously, the adoption tends to be a little faster for that reason, if nothing else. And that has also brought in its wake a lot of changes in the way the technology business is done. We've had a global service delivery model for some time, and now with the advent of digital, which is not only changing the way technology is provided, but also the way technology and business are, that admixture happens. And that there is nothing like a pure technology service anymore. It's technology embedded with business and the domain, embedded with consulting because it has larger implications for the business. There's also a trend towards looking more at the outcomes rather than the technology inputs, which means that, the kind of work that you do and the kind of risk sharing, all these have changed. So, without going into the details, what I want to say is that these technology changes have not only affected what technology can do, but also how it is provided and how business in this space is done. The second big bucket that I talked about is the political and economic shifts, which in a sense there is an interplay also between them. And these have been some huge seismic shifts like Brexit, the election of President Trump, which many people did not anticipate. And there have also been some less seismic but perceptible changes like, the economic slowdown in many countries, then the demographic shifts which are taking place, Japan being the prime example of that, and then, the kind of currency fluctuations which are taking place, all of which are in some ways interlinked. So those also do have both a direct and an indirect impact. Because indirect impact because, it does impact business confidence, it does impact the way people make investments in technology, it does constrain people in terms of saying, when I make this investment, it's a long-term investment, but do I know what that long-term is which I'm preparing for? So these two are impacting, and what we see is the resultant of all of these. So when companies are looking at the problem, I think they are looking at this entire spectrum of issues, and it's not easy.
So one specific issue that you are currently perhaps battling with is H1B visas. I know that NASSCOM has been trying to connect with its counterparts in America and trying to find out what the government could actually do to either restrict or contain H1B visas, which in turn seems to be a very critical component of India's, at least the American part of the export business. So what's the next step there?
You see, the H1B visa, while it has hogged a lot of the headlines, I think we should also look at it with a certain sense of proportion. The number of new H1B visas which are issued to Indian companies is about 15,000 or thereabouts, maybe 15 to 20,000, somewhere in that range. And the number of people who are working in the industry is 4 million in India, roughly, a shade under that. So it's not as if this is a be-all and end-all issue for the industry. There is no doubt that US being a 62% market share in terms of our exports, and that these people who work on-site do have an important multiplier for the rest of the business in the US because they interface with clients and so on. So it does have an important impact. But the heart of the whole issue is that there is a skill shortage in the US. It's well documented by US government sources, etc. So they are grappling with some of those challenges in terms of skill shortage. And in fact, they are better off because in some other countries they are grappling with a pretty serious unemployment problem and a shortage of high skills at the same time. In the US, the unemployment is pretty well under control. It's just a shade over 5%, which is not too bad. While of course in the high skills area it is 2%, which shows that there is a shortage, because anything under 4% is regarded as a shortage. So, so therefore, you know, in dealing with this issue, it's important that these perspectives are shared, because there has been a move in terms of the campaign rhetoric, in terms of some of the emotive stories that are built up in the media, that somehow all these people who are coming in on visas are taking away American jobs or job opportunities for Americans. The reality is completely different. The reality is that there are 2.4 unfilled jobs which require STEM skills, and they are not being filled because there aren't people. Yeah, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And if you take IT and related areas, it's half of them. So even if you take only IT and computer related jobs, it's more than 1 million jobs lying unfilled, as against, you know, about 15,000 people going in.
So the demand supply equation is clearly in favor of Indian engineers going abroad, and therefore you feel that they H1B, at least from a demand supply point of view, should be, you know, I mean, it should come to engineers going from here. But on the other hand, I think there seems to be a concern about foreigners coming to US, taking away jobs. So, I mean, my question is, what are companies doing? I think, so, I mean, finally it's the companies who, or the clients who actually bring engineers there or write contracts here.
No, as I said, you know, when companies look at it, they are not looking at the H1B visa issue in isolation. They are also looking at the larger secular trends in the industry because of technology shifts. And they are also looking at, you know, some of these political and policy changes that come in their wake. So if you look at the larger technology changes, those changes in terms of a shift towards outcome based, a shift towards more of domain and consulting, also result in a different mix of skills, different mix of people, different mix of on-site and off-site, because domain knowledge comes more when you are looking at people locally. So, so those shifts were happening anyway, which were necessitating a higher degree of local hiring for certain kinds of skills, which were now entering the equation in a much stronger way than before. So to some extent they were already making those shifts. Now, these policy changes which are being talked about are not looking at that whole complex jigsaw puzzle. They're just looking at it as, you know, people are coming in, impacting jobs, and put some constraints on them, which I think is a much more simplistic view than the reality.
And have you had any recent conversations with your counterparts in America?
Well, this is an area where, as you know, the industry, not only in India, even in the US, there have been concerns expressed, because it's the IT sector and equally the whole innovation, you know, ecosystem depends heavily on immigrants, and a very large percentage of innovative startups in the US have an Indian entrepreneur as a part of that founding members. In fact, in the NILF, one of the speakers had actually said it's as high as 83%. Now, I don't know whether that's the right figure, but certainly it's well above 50% for sure. So, if both the innovation as well as the IT absorption and delivery capability are adversely impacted in the US, then that is not good for the US economy, leave aside the Indian economy or the Indian industry.
Right, okay, so let me move beyond H1B. The overall growth projections for information technology services seems to be quite positive, right? We were talking about 2.6% growth, now we are talking about a 5% growth. So it seems to me that the tide seems to be rising. So if the tide is rising, how can that benefit, and could that in some ways counter all of this that we've spoken of till now?
Of course it will, of course it will. And I think that is the reason behind our high degree of confidence in the within the industry, because the whole tide is raising, you know, all boats, and in that sea of opportunity, India is very well placed for several reasons. Number one, of course, we already have a reasonably well-recognized track record across the world. It's well-recognized the capabilities that exist. We have a young demographic profile for the country. We have a high number of, STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics people graduating. And we have the ability to quickly reskill people. The industry has done that repeatedly in the face of earlier challenges. So I think that we are better placed to take advantage of the opportunity created by the rising tide. But it's not simple. I don't want to leave an impression that there is anything automatic about it or that it is simple. A lot will depend on how well we tackle as an industry, as a country, the whole skilling challenge. And if we are able to do that, I think it's there for the taking. We've also seen that India's share has moved up at a steady pace. And therefore, I think we don't see any...
India's share of global IT services.
India's share in the global sourcing of IT has gone up, and we are now at close to 56%, 56-57% in that range. So net, that's been a good story. However, because of the complexity of these challenges and the fact that this challenge varies from geography to geography, vertical to vertical, company to company, it all depends on how well an Indian service provider is able to read all of these and then position themselves to continue to realize the old traditional business to the extent it's there, but actually move as quickly as possible into the new digital space. So what I'm implying is that there will be a much bigger differentiation between the performance of individual companies. But the industry as a whole and India as a whole, I think the prospects are certainly extremely bright.
Okay. So last question, Mr. Chandrasekharan. What's your outlook and what are the 3 key challenges and tasks that you see for NASSCOM in the coming year?
Our key challenge, number 1, I would put as the skilling challenge. The skills that are needed are not only huge, they are shifting rapidly, and they require radically different approaches to deal with that skilling challenge and to be able to be very agile about it. We don't have the luxury of waiting 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. We don't have the luxury of saying, okay, these were the skills required for the last 5 years, let's plan for that. It's changing literally by the year, if not faster. So skilling is challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is the anti-globalization and protectionist forces which are rising across the world. And to be able to spread this message as to why it is important in the area of high technology to keep a sense of proportion and balance in dealing with the complex political challenges. The third is that as the nature of business is changing and people have to move from providing pure technology services to a mix of technology, domain and consulting, building that capability and building the same enviable reputation in that broader space as we did in the technology space is the third part of the challenge. And I think these 3 are the critical challenges for the industry.
Well, that's all we have time for on Policy Watch this week. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.